transparencies and the slides. This is just a course that I gave already 8 years ago in the URGS. So time flies. It has been adapted a little bit, and obviously every time you recheck things you have done, you find bunches of mistakes. So hopefully this is a little bit better than the one that I gave 8 years ago. Well, the intention is that after these 4 sessions, that will be a little bit compressed, perhaps too much theory in it. You should be able to figure out, once you have some problem about discerning about the structure of a fluid or a solid, to figure out which probe, which kind of scattering experiment you want to use, where to go, because I will mention a few installations all over the world where you can get access to these facilities. Most of them are for free if your project is significant. And what will be the conditions? Obviously, this part that you have to devise in your head, and there is the important contribution always from the person, the researcher responsible for the instrument. Without them, there's no way to do nothing, because this type of devices are much too complicated for us to handle. Okay, so this is a little bit of the outline of the talk. Let's see where I managed to get today. We will start to explain why are we interested in scattering and the types of scattering we will be dealing with, which probe to choose to analyze different aspects. We can study structures in different degrees of length and time, because we will also consider dynamics. And then mention a little bit about the fundamental sources, that neutron and X-ray sources. There's also light scattering. I will just say a few words about light scattering. It's also very important in the case of soft matter, but the most complicated stuff is neutron and X-ray scattering. And most of what I say about X-ray scattering applies to light scattering as well. Only that in some circumstances, light scattering is easier to have in the lab. So you have more immediate access to light scattering apparatus. And then I will tell you a little bit of fundamentals. So you have some idea of what we are talking about when we talk about form factors or scattering lengths, to see what's the physics behind them. I guess most, if not all of you, are physicists or in the process of becoming physicists. So terminology at least will be rather common. This is a little bit uncomfortable because it's too high. Okay, I will try to be there. So all these scattering techniques, they make use of the particle wave duality. And they use this to probe materials. So the wavelength associated with any particle, or if we think about photons, is just the wavelength. We don't have mass there. Will determine exactly what we can see. Obviously, we have a very large wavelength, and we are looking, for instance, at the distance between two atoms in a lattice, and the wavelength is twice that size. We won't see anything at all. So we have to think in these terms. So, and these are the crucial quantities we will be dealing with. In the case of X-rays, that is photons, here we don't have a mass, we will be dealing with wavelengths between 1 angstrom and 100 angstroms. So this is quite a wide range. For electrons, that's for electron microscopy, we have between 0.1 angstrom and 10 angstroms. That means electrons will tell you a lot about the structure of materials at the very, very short distance which we can actually sample. And then for neutrons, we have different types of neutrons depending on the temperature. So temperature of neutrons, what we mean with the temperature of neutrons? In the neutron sources, they can be equilibrated with environment. So we can have thermal, which more or less are equilibrated at ambient temperature, room temperature, or cold neutrons, which are actually cooled down. And obviously, this equilibration means that in the case of thermal neutrons, we have a distance between 1.8 and 3 angstroms, and this is the standard to probe the structure, for instance, the microscopic structure of liquids or solids. And cold neutrons that actually tell you much more about supramolecular correlations because we can reach up to 20 angstroms, so 2 nanometers. That's quite a big distance. Visible and UV light from 1 micron to 10 angstroms. So here we are in the realm of soft matter correlations. That is colloids, particles that have sizes of 1 micron or hundreds of nanometers, polymers, and so on. So you want to study this type of materials, you have to think of light scattering or X-rays reaching up to 100 angstroms. You see that they overlap, right? And here you have some example of the kind of things you can check. By the way, I will have all these slides available for you. Hopefully they will give me your email addresses and send you a link to a shared directory where you can access to the PDFs, right? Because otherwise it will be useless. So you see that here we have all these diffraction techniques that sample atomic structure. When you go to micelles and porous media, you are in the realm of atomic force microscopy, also diffraction, and here X-ray scattering, small angle neutron scattering for viruses, precipitates. When you have proteins, grain structure, bacteria, you have imaging techniques, microscopy, then you enter into the visible light and UV light, or light scattering as well, right? So you have this table, which is typically gives you technique and scale, right?
The dashed line means what?
The dashed line is that it's in between. That is the complicated realm where you have to overlap techniques. You might be able to.
Blank space.
You cannot do anything, right? Well, let's go a little bit to the basics. We have 2 types of scattering, and this is basic mechanics. Because when we talk about scattering, we talk about collisions. In principle, it's collisions with particles with mass, and this is the energy associated, the quantum energy associated with a particle with a mass mu, or particles without mass, but still have an energy and momentum associated that are photons, right? This is the de Broglie energy expression, right? When we have elastic scattering, momentum is always conserved, but in the case of elastic scattering, the incident particle changes direction and keeps the energy. The quantity that we will be interested in is this big Q, that is the difference between the 2 vectors, the incident vector, that is the forward scattering, and the scattered particles, neutrons or X-rays, right? So these are the quantities: incident wave vector, scattered wave vector, and scattering or transfer wave vector, right? And here the modules of these 2 vectors are identical. If the modules are different, like in this case, here we have the inelastic case, right? Here, sorry. Where we have energy loss. In this case, you see that the scatter wave vector is shorter, or energy gain. That depends on the interaction. Actually, when a particle, say a neutron or an electron, hits a lattice, it can actually lose energy because it transfers kinetic energy to the lattice, or it actually can interact with plasmons, which are oscillations that you have for phonons. You have oscillations in the lattice itself coming from thermal vibrations, and these phonons can transfer energy to the incident particle. And this is very important because this energy loss or gain will tell us about the dynamics, right? So inelastic scattering, dynamics. Elastic scattering, which normally is called diffraction, is for the structure, right? And now we have 2 types of scattering that are slightly different: coherent and incoherent scattering. And in the case of the coherent scattering, it's like the soldiers marching with the pass combined. We will have all particles, the incident radiation interacts with all particles in the same fashion, and the phase is the same. So you have interference, And this interference, due to this difference in phases, reflects the collective properties of the sample. In the case that you have incoherent scattering, that happens when you have mixtures, because particles are different, or because you have non-zero spin in the sample, in the case of neutrons. When you have non-zero spins, you have spin up, spin down, particles are different. So you don't have this exchangeability that you have in quantum mechanics that changes the wave function. When particles are just the same and you cannot distinguish. In the case of non-zero spin, you can distinguish the particles. That things change because each particle scatters independently, not like there, that interacts in the same fashion with all of them. And we have this, you can see this in this typical two-slit experiment. In this case, it's two-particle experiment. This would be the typical example, for instance, when you explain the duality of wave-particle for electrons. You think that one of these is a slit, upper slit, lower slit. Well, upper particle, lower particle. You have the incident, and you cannot distinguish one from the other. That means that you end up with a wave function whose amplitude is just the summation of all the amplitudes squared, right? That is coherent scattering. And when you end up here is just the diffraction pattern. Incoherent scattering. Well, each of them is an independent scatter because they are different. You cannot exchange. So the way in which you combine intensities is just the summation of the squares. This actually has this consequence. In the case of elastic, which is energy conserved, when you have coherent, you can get a measure of the material structure. Incoherent just gives you background noise, which you don't want, but sometimes it's unavoidable. That's one of the things about water. Let's go to water. That's the topic of the school. Water is a real pain for scattering experiments because hydrogens have spin up, spin down. This means that if you have real water, you have a lot of incoherent scattering, you have a huge background noise that sometimes can actually completely hide the signal. That's the reason why when you want to study properties of water, normally you use deuterated water. The problem is that, well, as I remember once how would I say this? Well, it was just una banca para una vaga. And in Spain, someone asked someone who was presented, but deuterated water, if you give deuterated water to drink to a donkey, you kill the donkey. Properties of deuterated water from the chemical point of view are very different. Particularly the constant, the Kw is different. That means that all what happens in your body if you drink deuterated water, all your ionic equilibrium gets completely disrupted. So it's the same to a certain point, but you have to live with that if you want to study the structure. For some things, it's different, and that's one of the things.
And you cannot subtract. You do the experiment with, mixing water and then subtract from an experiment with only water. It doesn't work like that.
No. If you use, it affects the whole signal, and you get all these incoherent things, and the incoherent section is huge. It's huge. So actually, it's really hard, and you have to work with deuterated water, which fortunately is relatively cheap. So all the things you do. Now, for inelastic scattering, sometimes it's a blessing. That's the other thing. In the case that you do inelastic scattering, it's very important because with the coherent part, what you get is the collective dynamics. So you can get a measure of how you have collective modes. For instance, you can have phonons or you can have plasmons. You can sample all these collective phenomena with coherent inelastic scattering. And the incoherent gives you the single particle dynamics. So with using the incoherent scattering, you can actually measure diffusion constants, self-diffusion constants, right? So you see, for one thing, it's just a bad thing, and for the other thing, it's just a blessing. It's just something that gives us information. So you see, incoherent is always single particle because they are not coupled. Coherent is multiple particles, right? Which proof to choose? Well, in the case of X-rays, well, X-rays are tricky because they interact with the shell, with the electron shell in the atoms. So it depends on the atomic number, right? So, for instance, if you do X-rays in water, you don't see the hydrogens. I didn't get it. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I can have or coherent or equivalent or elastic or inelastic or for example for water I can just have elastic like how
I think the question is
Depends on the experiment. I mean, elastic, inelastic, you choose the type of experiment. If you use a diffractometer, it will always be elastic. If you use a time of flight diffractometer, then you sample inelastic because you sample the time between collisions and the reception of the scatter particles. But that's just the experiment you realize. In the case of coherent, incoherent, if you use water, you will have a combination of both. There is a small section of coherent coherent diffraction coming from the hydrogens, a large contribution from the oxygen. If you are lucky enough, if you have a molecule with a large section, effective section against the collision of neutrons, well, the incoherent part of the hydrogen is irrelevant. You can discard it. But in the case of water, it is not. It is not. So you have two hydrogens, you have oxygen. Oxygen doesn't have a section that is too large for neutrons, but it has a contribution, a coherent contribution, right? So both are there. And there's tables that you can find at NIST, at the National Institute for Standards in the United States. They have in the web page the table with all the sections. And that's one of the first things you have to do when you want to plan an experiment. Check what type of material you're using. Because sometimes, even some of them, they don't have any section at all. So you can't do an experiment. Or some are transparent, which sometimes is good, sometimes is bad. Vanadium, for instance, is completely transparent to neutrons. And that's good to make windows to allow neutrons to get into the containers. But if you want to study the structure of vanadium, then you are in a problem. You have to use a different type of probe, right? Well, small atomic number atoms will be difficult to detect because of that, because the number of electrons. And there's another problem. And then you have elements, we have similar atomic number, and then you also have little contrast. They are difficult to distinguish, like cobalt or nickel. When you have already large atomic numbers and there's little difference, well, you are in a problem to distinguish the signals from both of them. And the other problem they have is that X-rays are strongly attenuated by the walls of the containers or the furnaces. So, for instance, it was up until recently very difficult to measure molten salts or molten materials because you have to have furnace, a container that is resistant to temperature, and for most of these materials, actually everything was just absorbed. So you have to use neutrons that can actually go through the material. Electrons. Well, electron-electron interaction also depends on the atomic number. It's relatively cheap. It has a high flux, but the samples have to be very thin because they have a very high absorption. And you have to be very careful with if you have magnetic moments inside the samples because electrons are deflected by the magnetic moments. And this is very important. Watch for radiation damage because when you use electrons, it's very easy. If you have some, I had a friend that used to do electron microscopy, and you could see that you were looking, you could see the electrons melt the sample. So you have to be very quick to do your measurements because you end up destroying the samples. So normally electron diffraction for many materials is a destructive technique unless you have materials that have a very high melting temperature. one of the great advances this day for biology. Up until now, biology was a technique in which they hardly could use electron microscopy. They use scanning electron microscopy because they cover the samples in gold. And then they make these nice pictures of small bags and all these things, but they were covered in gold to protect the sample. Now they use cryomicroscopy, by which they actually manage to freeze the sample, pray that the structure of the sample is not altered or destroyed by the freezing procedure, and then they measure the electrons up until the melting of the sample. But this is the latest technique that is being used by the people that do structural biology. So things are changing very rapidly. Here you have the advantages regarding neutrons. They have a very weak interaction with neutron, so they are a non-destructive technique. A typical example, for instance, many years ago, when they tried to recover the mummy of one of these big famous emperors, pharaohs, it was sent to France. It was full of bugs, and the way to get rid of the bugs was to use neutrons, because you could kill the bugs and do not destroy the sample. Destroys everything alive, but does not destroy the sample. They have very little attenuation because they don't have charge. That's one of the good things. They have magnetic dipole, so you can actually sample the magnetic structure of samples, right? And the interaction with the nuclei, well, it depends a lot on the type of nuclei. And this is something that is highly predictable. It's calculations to determine the interaction of the neutrons with the nuclei are really tough, and normally things are done on an experimental way. So you see how it diffracts, and then you calculate what's the effective sound source. So the nuclear interaction is very simple, so it's very easy to model. You will see later when we do some theory about that, that is just a delta function. It's treated like a delta function. And you can tune the wavelength by this tuning the temperature of the neutrons. On the downside, since the interaction is weak, you need large samples, grams. Whereas for X-rays these days, thanks to synchrotrons, you can use milligrams. So it's a factor of 10 to 3, or even more. Sources are expensive, so you have to go to large facilities. You can have in the lab nearby a neutron facility. And the flux typically is low compared with the flux in X-rays. When they use X-rays lamps, fluxes were extremely low. But synchrotrons have changed completely the situation. And you have one nearby in Campinas, right?
It has no problem with the interfaces. But you mentioned the other techniques, they have problems
Yeah.
with the interfaces.
Neutrons, it has less problems because you can choose the material. There are lots of materials that are transparent, or that you know where the peaks are, so you can subtract. So you do the measurement of the cell in vacuum, and you have the peaks. You choose cells that have diffraction peaks away from the area you want to explore, and then you remove it. So it's much easier to handle than other things. You see here the penetration depth for neutrons, and you see that it's more or less stable. Goes down sometimes. But if you look at X-rays or electrons, well, it's good for low atomic number, but as the atomic number goes down, it practically, this is logarithmic scale, so compare. There's 2 orders of magnitude below for large atomic numbers. So that's also important when you have to deal with samples with relative size, or you have to take in. Well, there are some furnaces and cryostats that have been devised lately that can actually solve the situation. Problem is they are only available at certain places, and there's a high demand for these materials. Whereas for neutrons, it's very easy to get access to them and have min time allocated. These are the ones for the Australian synchrotron, the capillary furnace. You see the range, and you see the range for the synchrotron in France, right? So here you have a comparison, and you have all different types of sources for neutrons, depending. And you can choose, you see the brightness, the flux, and you see the latest one, that is this one, that's an undulator in the APS facility in the United States. It has a relatively large source for X-rays, whereas neutrons are up there with fluxes are 13 orders of magnitude below, right? So that determines the size of the sample you have to use. X-ray scattering using synchrotrons has a very high sensitivity. And this is an example that shows, this is an experiment we did ourselves, that is a very tiny amount of toluene absorbed in a zeolite. And the black peaks are the empty sample, and the one is with the zeolite absorbed. Well, all this splitting that you see here, that is very important to see the structure of toluene inside the zeolite, disappears if you use neutrons. You just get a single peak. And that's because of the high accuracy of the X-rays from synchrotron sources, right? The acquisition time, if you look at here, sample size. The sample size we use was 50 milligrams. For neutron scattering, you need 2.5 grams. And if the samples are expensive, or you have to produce them, that is very important. And the acquisition time here was 15 minutes. In the case of inelastic neutron scattering, was 12 hours. So normally when you plan your neutron scattering experiments, you go there with your colleagues, and you do turns in the machine, because you have to be running all night long to get decent. And here you see the neutron cross sections. You see that what happens with the X-ray cross section, and here with neutrons. So that also will help you to choose the probe. On the other hand, neutrons can see things that X-rays do not see. For instance, nitrogen. This is a powder diffraction of this material, an oxide of cerium with indium and nitrogen, with these peaks. And when you do neutron diffraction, lo and behold, you have plenty of peaks that come from the nitrogen. Because nitrogen is has a very low atomic number, is in a relatively low amount compared to other materials. The other ones are much bigger, so they interact much more with X-rays, and they completely hide the structure of the nitrogen. So this is also important. Look at the material. Okay, how do you get neutrons? You have two alternatives. Fission reactors, which you have a fission reaction, like an atomic bomb, but it's controlled and moderated. And these are continuous sources, because during the process of the fission, you are always producing neutrons that get outspelled from this, this composition of this uranium-236. But the fate of these sources is doomed, because no one wants to have a nuclear reactor anymore. So practically, I don't know in Russia if they plan to do anything with the one in Dubna, but the ones in Europe or in the United States, they have their future canceled, so to speak. New sources are spallation sources. And spallation, well, it's just a phenomenon. This refers to something that happens where the miner with the peak hits a rock, and then you get the sparks coming out of the rock. That's the same thing. You hit a sample with a huge speed particle. That could be an alpha particle. And actually, this extracts neutrons from the sample. You bombard it with high energy particles. You can use high alpha particles because they are charged, and you can accelerate them using electric fields, right? And these are all pulsed sources. That means it's not a continuous source. They come in pulses. You can use the pulses also for scientific purposes, but you have to think that you will get peaks. This also affects, because since there is a time, there is a spread in energy. You remember Heisenberg. Uncertainty in energy times uncertainty in time. You have this uncertainty because the pulse has a certain duration in time. That is an uncertainty. That means that you have a spread in energy. Spread in energy that you don't have in fission reactors. There you can actually choose the energy with high precision.
But from your picture, you also have protons.
Yeah, you also have protons, but you have to separate it because protons are very easy because they are charged. So you move them wherever you want. But the neutrons, they go ahead, and that's the. You have to, for the neutrons, what you have to do is to absorb all those that go in the wrong direction, those that you don't want. You put some material that absorbs the neutron and let pass only those that you want in a certain direction. Well, with this you get time structure. You have to be moderated, the neutron energies. And you compare with fission reactors, you have extremely high fluxes at the peak, around 10 to 16 neutrons for a square centimeter in a second. Here are several, and most of them are time-of-flight reactors, right? Here you have the split of velocities that you have in neutrons, and you use different moderators to sort of control the energy. Liquid hydrogen, heavy water, or hot graphite, depending on the speed. And in this way, you can select fast neutrons and slow neutrons, as I mentioned, or hot and cold neutrons, right? The fast ones reach very, very high speeds, as you can see here. You have all these moderators. What you try to do is to force the neutrons to bonds of some light material and to keep them at some desired temperature, energy. And, well, you end up directing the neutron beam to the sample, and you have a detector, some shielding to avoid the neutrons to escape. Everything is very delicate here, and for instance, samples most of the times are discarded, or you have to wait, depending on the subproducts that get out of the experiment, you have to wait 6 months, 1 year, or they simply are discarded as radioactive waste, right? So you cannot take your sample away, as you do when you do X-rays. So most of the times you lose your sample. And ILL, this is a nuclear fission reactor, which will be closed if it is not already closed. And here are the temperatures at work. When we're thinking of thermal neutrons, you have thermal equilibrium with the temperature of cooling water around the reactor, 60 degrees. And you have this wavelength. For cold neutrons, you have liquid hydrogen, 25 K, and you have this wavelength, you see, which is considerably longer. And hot neutrons, this is just practically intranuclear structure. It's below 1 angstrom. So we don't use this sort of hot neutrons for any study concerning the structure of matter, because we are interested in interatomic distances. So thermal or cold. This is the evolution of the neutron flux. You see it has increased quite a few orders of magnitude since the first neutron reactor. This is a standard steady state when you do the scattering and you check for this angle, the scattering angle. You have the detectors here, and you try to use a monochromator in which you select the wavelength of the neutrons, right? And have a narrow spectral band. For monochromators, typically people use crystals because you can choose precisely the diffraction peak of the crystal, and that's the peak that will be transmitted. For a time of flight, as I mentioned, you have this limitation, that is Heisenberg again, and you have a wide spectral band, because you will have a band of energies depending on the split in time of the pulse, right? And you detect all directions at the same time. And you check for the time from the collision to the detector. To choose the right lambda, here you use what is called a Fermi chopper, which is basically a chopper. Is this thing you see here that is rotating and selects those neutrons that are in phase with the chopper. Has a hole and it rotates. Those that have the right wavelength pass, those that don't hit the chopper and bounce back, right? You have an error of between 5 and 20% in the selection of the wavelength. And well, this is a selection, and the reactions don't have any limit between the distance to the source, but in the spallation source, obviously, you have a limitation because the time structure defines the position of the instruments. So depending on what you want to study, you have to move the instrument closer or further away from the sample. That's not the case in reactors. How do we detect neutrons? Because I said detector. Well, they do hardly interact with the material. So how do you do it? Have no charge, the mass is too small, they have very small magnetic moment, and the electric moment even smaller. Well, they can be detected by the recoil with other particles after a collision, and because they induce nuclear reactions, as they do in spallation. Well, it's typically scintillation, a typical bubble chamber of the old times. You have the sample here, you have the source, the neutron enters here and produces a reaction, actually extracts ultraviolet photons produced from local excited states because the neutrons end up ionized in the sample. Here you have a gas. You can have lithium, boron, or helium that interact with neutrons. Neutrons produce a nuclear reaction. And here you get photons, and you detect the photons. You do not detect the neutrons. So the process is very delicate. There's a lot of cooking in here. And this is one of the reasons why sometimes some people do not believe very much in the results of the experiments, because there is a lot of process between the experiment and when you get the structure factor. Synchrotrons are these things. This is huge rings in which you accelerate the electron with magnetic and electric fields. And precisely due to this acceleration, the electron loses energy, and this energy is lost in the way of X-rays. X-rays are extremely coherent. And that's the good thing. You have a very small window, and they have a very high intensity. So the radiation comes as a result of this revolving path. Here you have these facilities. You have in Campinas, you have all these synchrotrons, and you have all these neutron sources. Usually, anyone can apply to any neutron source or any synchrotron source. The project just has to be interesting. And the good thing from my experience is that peer review that you get in these places is one of the fairest ones. Actually, the reviewers are there to help you. Not just simply because we don't have money, that's it. There is no funding for your project. No. Here they actually say, these are the weak points of your things, and you send the project again with these things correctly. They normally send you, sometimes it takes 3 times until you get your time approved, but in the end, things are much better. One good thing, one advice, a piece of advice, if you are planning experiment, do some simulation first. Because it's a good idea to see what you want to see with the simulation in computer. That helps the referees to see if what you are planning is relevant or not. And what time is it? 10:15. Let's make a short break. No?
15 minutes.
No, less. 5 minutes. 5 minutes break because now we start with the theory.
Tem 5 minutos de descanso, gente. Dá para ir no banheiro.
É até a meia, não?
Por isso que ele radia.
let's go back to fundamentals, see what we are dealing with. Actually, we are dealing with a collision problem. The only question is that, given the size of the particles, we have to go to quantum mechanics. So the basic scheme, if we think of a single particle problem, we will have a single particle that hits the target, and, well, it comes scattered with different probabilities to one detector or another detector, right? Simplest case is think of spinless particles, think of elastic collision. We will not consider loss of kinetic energy. We will neglect multiple collisions because actually in a real material, neutrons will sometimes hit one particle and then hit another, and then we have what is called multiple scattering. In real experiments, you will have to correct for multiple scattering. Only that, you will not do it yourself. Typically, all these basic phenomena you have to subtract are treated in packages that are in the installation. So they have their own packages where the basic things, the basic treatment of data is performed automatically, like removing the effect of the container or removing the effect of multiple scattering. All this is done with packages that have been developed there. We ignore, so far, the coherent interference with other dispersion sites, because we are just considering one single dispersion site. And we assume a pair interaction between the incident particle and the sample, right? So we have two masses, the mass of the sample and the mass of the scatterer, and the relevant quantity will be the reduced mass, which is just formulated like that. And we have a region, which is the region which will be the one where this potential of the scatterer is relevant. Outside that region, the potential of the scatterer disappears. So this is a problem of scattering of a particle by a potential, right? Simplifying things. We will define a quantity that is the flux, the number of particles per unit of time and surfaces, and solid angle. And these are important quantities. You know, the flux and the number of particles is precisely this quantity. That's called the differential scattering cross-section. And this is the quantity that will come out of our experiment. So the quantity that will be given to us by the researcher responsible of the instrument will be that quantity. If you integrate this thing over all the scattering angles, you get the total scattering cross-section. When we consider a single particle of a single species, this is a very important quantity. And this is the one that is tabulated, and that determines whether you can use neutrons or not, the total scattering cross-section. This quantity that is here, the differential cross-section, you can have it for a single particle or for the whole sample. The one you will get in your experiment obviously corresponds to the whole sample and will give you a measurement of the structure of the fluid. We will consider a potential that is not dependent on time. That means we can use the standard Schrödinger equation, and the solution of that equation for this problem is a plane wave in time, right? You have a part that depends on the position, and since there is no dependence on the potential, you have a plane wave in time. If we express energy in terms of momentum and mass, we end up with an expression in which we will only focus on the solutions with positive energy, right? We rebuild the equation a little bit using this U of R, in which we add this term. So this is for simplicity and have a simpler expression for the Schrödinger equation. This is just the Schrödinger equation, rewritten in a more fashionable way. And we have two asymptotic behaviors that we can get for the problem in question. We have for t minus infinity, the plane wave, the free particle. This is the incident particle that comes freely flying and has just a plane wave to describe it. And in the limit of plus infinity, a spherical wave that is proportional to this. That means a free particle that is incident comes as a plane wave, gets out once it is dispersed as a spherical wave. You can get that simply by analyzing the behavior of the Schrödinger equation in these two limits. So we already know quite a bit about this. If we now write this in terms of just the radial part, we split the solution of the spherical equation in radial and angular dependent parts. Well, the radial part is just this one. And the whole function comes with this term that depends on the angles, and this term that depends only on the separation between the scattered particle and the scattered, right? And the whole wave function in the limit of infinite separation comes with a plane wave, the incident wave, which is part of it is not scattered. This is what is called forward scattering. That means the neutrons or whatever particles get through the sample. This term, that is the spherical wave, and the prefactor is what is called the scattering amplitude. This term is what will give you information concerning the structure when you think about a sample. It depends on the angles, and it depends on the wave vector, right? Again, nothing new, just using Schrödinger equation. And this is the schematic representation. Here you have the plane wave, hits the scatterer, and a new wave comes like that. Scatter in all directions with this prefactor. A circular wave, right? Now, we have to think in terms of fluxes. Well, this is very similar to what is a classical density current. A classical density current is nothing but the density times the velocity. Nothing very special about that. And we go from classic to quantum. Well, the density somehow is just the wave function. And here we have the velocity operator, or the momentum operator, right? And this gives you the quantum flux for a given wave function. Okay, we use this equation, the plane wave and the spherical wave, and we end up with this expression for the flux, in which we have Fk squared. And this is very important, because this Fk, which was the scattering amplitude, determines the flux once it is squared. And we will see that this will appear once and again in all cases. If we manipulate this a little bit more and we go down to the differential cross-section, we end up with this very important relation. The differential cross-section is the scattering amplitude squared. This is the basic equation for diffraction. We will see that later on we will introduce here multiple scatterers, which will be, in the case of coherent scattering, will give us the structure, and we will see that how this is squared, right?
So the differential cross-section is what you get from the experiment.
Right, right. Because that's exactly when you come here. In principle, you have the spherical wave, simply. But its intensity in each direction is modulated by this term. And this modulation reflects the structure of the scatterer. In this case, the structure of the scatterer is a spherical particle, so it will be a very simple function. But when you have interference, it will give you the information about the structure factor the spatial disposition of the particles.
These two terms, they come from the solution of the Schrödinger
Right,
equation.
right.
But this sigma comes from what? From your, because you're equating two things.
The sigma,
The sigma comes, because they are not in the equation, so you come from.
okay, let's see, that was over here. Stationary states, here. That comes from the definition of the flux. So it's just this quantity that defines how the flux changes depending on the angle. That's why it's called differential cross-section. How particles are scattered in a different way depending on the direction. That depends on the shape of the potential in the case of a single scatterer, and in the case of multiple scatterers, depends on the distribution of the scatterers, and obviously the shape of the potential. We will see an example for a simple potential. And later on, we will see what happens when we have multiple scatterers. The square term, again, comes from the flux. And the differential cross-section is connected with that. Flux in all the cases, right? Okay, well, a little bit back to very basic things. Green's functions. I guess, well, probably most of you or some of you are familiar with this, but this is just a technique to solve differential equations. Actually, you have a differential equation that you don't know how to solve. This will be an operator times a function, given a certain function, and you define for this operation its corresponding green function, which actually ends up in a, is sort of an instantaneous response of the system, what defines this green function, so to speak. With this definition here, the solution, the general solution of this differential equation is this one. Well, so far we only have changed things and rename expressions. Practically, it seems that we haven't done anything, right? For instance, Poisson's equation corresponding would be the response to a point charge. That means G of R, it's just the delta. That means that the charge density is a delta function. Forget about the epsilon, whatever. Well, with this, you can solve Poisson's equation. Here is the general solution, formulated as before. And you can actually solve this, and lo and behold, you end up with Coulomb's potential, right? You use Fourier transforms to solve this equation. Let's do the same thing with scattering, with the Schrödinger equation to get the scattering equation. And this is a very important expression. Again, you have this differential equation, and you have the corresponding green function, right? That would be the response to a point potential. Actually, in the case of neutrons, the potential is just precisely this delta function. In the case of all electrons, it's a different thing, right? Well, the general solution is this one, where this psi naught is precisely the solution of the homogeneous Schrödinger equation. With this, you end up obtaining two green functions. What is coming, an incoming green function and an outgoing green function, which are nothing but the spherical waves, plus and minus. And the scatter function, once you solve you express the whole thing properly, for the function that ends up after the scattering, you get the incident wave function, that is plane wave, and this term. The outgoing green function, which is this term, times the potential, times the scatter function. This is the key scattering equation, which is nothing but the Schrödinger equation written in integral form. You can take the limit, and once again, if you take the limit of r going to infinity, you end up with the same equation as before. Important thing, Born approximation. That's key. In the Born approximation, what you do is you actually can try to solve the equation by inserting and inserting once and again the scatter function into the equation, and you end up with a series. You see here, you have the equation, you have here the solution. Imagine that you try to solve this in an iterative fashion. You get an approximate, you get this, and you insert it here again. You get a new solution, and you insert it here again. You end up with a series like this one. This will be the first iterate, this will be the second contribution, and so on and so on. With the potential that comes first single power, a linear term, then quadratic power, and so on. If the potential is weak, you can discard all other terms, and you end up with the linear term. And also, you have to have another constraint, that the extension of the potential, or scattering length, is smaller than the incident wavelength. That is called the adiabatic approximation. So you truncate this in the linear term with the Born approximation, and you end up with an equation like this, with the scattering amplitude defined in this way. From here to here, if you go back from U to V and have all the proper terms, this is the equation for the differential scattering. So now, if you know the potential, you insert it here, and you know for a single scatterer what's the differential scattering.
Weak, if you defer the technique. For instance, if I go neutron, I would expect that because those don't have charge, that
Neutron is always weak normally, so it works for neutrons. For electrons, it's tricky. It's tricky. Depends on, and also electrons are much more complicated because the scatterer itself is not one atom. It's another electron. It's the electrons in the cloud. So that's a pain. So actually, what people do is do some complicated quantum mechanical calculations and tabulate everything. I'll go back to that later on. But here we. That would be perfect for neutrons, and we will see later how it works for neutrons. Okay. And this is the extension of the scatterer, and one has to be careful. We assume that there is just a single point scattering, which is not true for X-rays, for instance, or UV, right? In normal conditions, you will have a scattering here. Well, that would complicate a lot everything. We just neglect that. Well, this is the typical interaction with a neutron and a nucleus that was proposed by Yukawa. The Yukawa potential, aside from being fundamental in soft matter physics, was first introduced into nuclear physics by Hideki Yukawa. And this is relatively small. So if this term here is not big, actually you can solve the equation. And here you see that the azimuthal angle goes away, psi goes away, and you end up only with dependence on theta, right? Well, that's good, because it's telling you that even if your particles are being scattered by a single atom, you see that if they interact with a Yukawa, there is a dependence on the angle. For certain directions, there will be one intensity, and they will depend on sin. So, particularly, forward scattering is theta is the direction in which there is less scattering, because this is it's higher scattering, because this is 0 here. If you have theta here, this becomes bigger. You have less scattering, right? This was like that, right? So you end up with these solutions. Forward scattering is smaller than backward scattering. And you have intermediate situations for pi half, 90 degrees. And there is no dependence on psi, right? Another interesting case is Coulomb. Well, this is bad mathematics, I tell you, but good results. So that's why I just tell you that this is typically when you handle Coulomb potentials, to do the trick to consider them the limit of the alpha here going to 0. If you do that with the expression before, you end up with this differential cross-section.
It's not weak.
It's not weak, and it's infinitely long-ranged. Yeah. So it completely destroys all the assumptions of the Born approximation. But it works. so you can use that. And actually, this result is correct. If you do the correct things for the Coulomb, you end up with this thing. But I want you to, you to be aware that this is not as it should be, right? If you do it right. So good results with bad math. Neutrons. Well, as I mentioned, neutrons are just point particles. So their potential is just like that of the green function, right? So with this scattering amplitude, you end up with this quantity and with a cross-section that is 4 pi times a squared. This is a very important result because this quantity is the one that is tabulated for neutrons. Whereas for electrons, you will have to use a function that is called a form factor that has a dependence on the wave number. Here, you have just a constant. Normally, the constant that is tabulated is this B, which is something like this weighted by the atomic mass. But it's basically the same thing as the scattering section for some reason. Now, the specific interaction is so complicated that normally B is determined experimentally. So the numbers you see in the tables were determined experimentally, doing experiments.
It's not dependent on theta.
And it does not depend on theta, no. Because they are point particles concerning the interaction with the neutron itself.
But with what might complicate is that, as you mentioned, the neutrons, you don't measure the neutrons, you measure the consequence.
No, when you detect, that's when you detect.
Okay.
That's in the detection process. Yeah. In the scattering process, it's just neutron collision, and you measure the angle of the deflected neutron. Electrons. In electrons, things are nastier, because there you have this term, which actually represents the interaction of Q, the wave incident, the difference between the incident wave vector and the position of the electrons with respect to the center, right? And you have to perform the summation for all the electrons, taking into account that they move at the same time. So, well, this is a real pain, and you end up with this thing. The summation of 4 Gaussians. That solves the problem. The function is relatively simple, and you go to the tables, the international crystallographic tables, and you have the values for AI, BI, and C for all the elements, right? And we will see later on in the hands-on session one case, particular case for carbon and for other materials, how you can actually use them. So, and this is an average. So you have to perform an average over all the positions of the electrons. That's the reason behind the brackets. And, well, and we can advance a little bit. If I manage to move the cursor to the right place. Right. Okay. Let's see. Let's see what happens now when we have multiple scatterers. That was the example we saw before. Oops. What happens? Is it strange? Well, okay. On the left, you see the plane wave, you see the scatterer, and you see the spherical wave. When you have all this lattice of scatterers, you have all the spherical waves, the scattered spherical waves, and you already see the pattern. You already see the interference. You will see that when you have places where you will find a constructed interference and a destructed interference in other places. So you will find correlations between the scatterers and the positions of the diffractions. Okay. In the case of neutron, well, the scattering, we assume it elastic because the nucleus are fixed, so energy are not transferred. And we have a potential that now is the summation of all the delta functions, all the scattering factors with the corresponding Bj term you see there, right? So the d terms are really not that important because all these are just constants, nothing else. This term here is called the Fermi pseudopotential, the whole thing. This is a potential spread all over the sample that is the summation of delta functions. So let's see what happens. We have the case of Born approximation. Neutrons are scattered only once, otherwise we will have a real mess. And we have superposition because all the scatterers are identical. They do not, you cannot distinguish one scatterer from the another. So the intensity is just the square of the summation of all the wave functions, right? And all these terms, precisely this term, the cross terms, depend on the positions of 1 and 2. That means that depend on the positions of the pair correlations. The first terms are independent, are single particle terms. So they do not show any correlation, but the cross terms are the important ones. That's the reason why coherent scattering gives you information about the structure. Remember that when you have incoherent scattering, all these terms are missing. You only have the first square of the wave functions. Okay. So the differential scattering cross-section is just that average. And when you think of that average, V of R is that term. You put it there. And you see that the F theta is just the summation of By. It's just delta function, and you have the incoming wave function. You see the e to the I minus qr is the plane wave function, the incoming wave function. So the result for the scattering amplitude is just this summation, and you end up with that summation square. That's the Born approximation there, and that's the essential result, the crucial result is the one in the left. I don't know why I cannot. Well, okay, it became strange.
Is about the position
That you can actually simply add all the delta terms.
Yeah.
That they are sort of independent and there are no cross correlations between these potentials. You simply add one and another.
But this means also that they are spatially distributed in a lattice?
No, not necessarily. No, anywhere. Anywhere. It can be a liquid. That doesn't actually mean anything.
Means that they don't interact.
They don't interact. You don't have cross terms. You don't have influence from one, which I mean, if they are very close, if you have, for instance, a molecule, Fermi approximation is a little bit questionable.
But it's not dependent if they have, the particles are correlated.
No.
It's not about the particles, about the potential of the particles with the scattering.
It depends. the Fermi approximation is acceptable as far as you can consider that the two nuclei do not interact, which is normally the case, right? Spin variables and particle positions are uncorrelated, so the averages can be separated. I mean, you can perform the analysis of the structure factor and the magnetic structure factor separately, right? Well, this is simply some manipulation of how you can express the B factor, the scattering length, in terms of an average, which is actually the quantity you will be using, and a fluctuation term. And in the end, you end up with this. For the case of elastic scattering, the first term, I see there is a mistake there. Yeah, right. That should be squared, what is inside the average, right? That should be squared. The first term is the structure factor. That's the quantity of interest that will come out of your experiment, right? And the second term is the incoherent scattering background. So if the B is large, you will have a huge contribution of the incoherent. Also realize that it's multiplied by n, by the number of particles. So in the case of water, of hydrogen, the B is large, the incoherent section is large. Normally, the incoherent part is just this difference. It's called like that. I mean, it's just... See? That's... if we consider coherent and incoherent contributions, you have to separate spin up neutrons and spin down neutrons, right? So you have a length, an average length that is for coherent terms. That is the combination of momentum, because these particles have of spin different from zero. Now, the first one is clear. The second one, that is the difference, is just a quantum mechanical combination, if you recall from Clebsch-Gordon and all these things. And the B is just this A times that, right? Here you have values for coherent and incoherent in some cases. There you have the sigma coherent for protons, for hydrogen, 1.8 coherent, 80 incoherent. So now you can imagine. Deuterium, you have 5.6 versus 2. Now you have aluminum, for instance. It's very interesting because it has no incoherent. So that's good in that respect. Bad if you want to study dynamics. Vanadium, coherent, practically nothing, which means that it's transparent. So typically windows in detectors are made of vanadium. And here has a case that is very interesting that we will go for it in the example. Argon, that has this particular isotope of argon has a huge value of coherent and 0 incoherent, whereas normal argon has a very small coherent section. So you can play with this to make argon invisible or visible, depending on what you want to do, right? So aluminum is used for windows, and vanadium is used for sample containers, right? And here's the web page where you can get all the values of all the elements, right? And here, that's actually the static structure factor, which again, systematically, here on the left is right, on the right is wrong. There's a square missing. I have to correct all these things. And that represents, as it says there, the two particle correlations in Fourier space. Later on, we will see how this brings to us a very familiar function, which is the pair distribution function that gives us the probability of two particles to be separated at the distance r, scale with the ideal gas probability. That means that huge separation, no correlation, goes to 1, not to density square. So these are important quantities. If one has to measure, later on I will split this into contributions from same particles, different particles. From the computational point of view, if you ever have to program one of these things, you have to recall that the proper way to do it is to use the square term as it is expressed there. Do it and perform the square and then the average. Because, let's see, here you have scatterings. No, well, next session we will go into that because otherwise this gets too loaded. Okay? So, thank you.
Agora a gente tem um coffee break e depois do coffee break eu vou fazer a lecture, tá bom? Vamos ver se funciona. Meu, senão acho até melhor eu copiar, que aí no pendrive